night, June 6, 1944, a man is sitting at his desk. His code name is Garbo. 3 years ago, Juan Garcia was a chicken farmer outside Barcelona, with no intelligence training, no military connections, and no plan beyond a burning hatred of fascism. Tonight, he is the most dangerous double agent in the world, and the message he will send in 72 hours will argue that the Normandy landings are fake, that the real invasion, 150,000 troops under General Patton, is aimed at Pas-de-Calais. The German High Command will believe him. They will hold their Panzer reserves 200 miles from the beaches where Allied soldiers are fighting to survive. 150,000 troops don't exist. Patton commands inflatable tanks, and the 27 spies feeding Garbo his intelligence have never drawn a single breath, because he invented every one of them. To understand how a chicken farmer ended up at a radio transmitter on D-Day, you need to start in Barcelona. Juan Pujol García was born on Valentine's Day, 1912, into a middle-class Catalan family. Nothing about his early life suggested espionage. He managed a poultry farm. He ran a cinema. He tried various small businesses, none of which particularly succeeded. He was, by every measurable standard, ordinary. Then the Spanish Civil War happened. Pujol was conscripted by the Republicans, deserted, hid, was conscripted again, and eventually crossed to the nationalist side. Not because he believed in Franco, but because he wanted to stay alive. He saw atrocities from both factions: Republican death squads, nationalist firing squads, communist purges, fascist brutality. The experience left him with something most people talk about, but few act on: a genuine, visceral hatred of totalitarianism in all its forms. When Nazi Germany began swallowing Europe in 1939, Pujol watched from Spain with the same horror he'd felt during the Civil War, and he made a decision that, given his resume, made no logical sense. He decided to fight back. He had no weapons, no training, no connections to anyone who mattered, no languages beyond Spanish and Catalan, no plan. What he had was conviction, the belief that even one man could do something to help destroy the Nazi machine. He later put it simply: "I had only one wish, to contribute personally to the victory of the Allies, to destroy the monster created by Nazism." It was an extraordinary ambition for a man whose greatest professional achievement to date was a failing poultry operation. But Pujol wasn't interested in what was reasonable. He was interested in what was necessary. In early 1941, he walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered to spy for Britain against Nazi Germany. He was turned away. He came back. Turned away again. He tried a third time through a different intermediary. Rejected. The British had no mechanism for evaluating a random Spanish civilian with no credentials and a story that sounded like either a fantasy or a trap. They dismissed him as a crank. It was one of the most expensive mistakes in the history of intelligence. But Pujol didn't quit. He made a calculation so audacious it bordered on insanity. If the British wouldn't let him spy for them, he would spy for the Germans instead and betray them from the inside. He walked across Madrid to the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and offered his services. He fabricated credentials, presented himself as a pro-German Spanish official with diplomatic access, and volunteered to travel to Britain as a German agent. The Abwehr, desperately short of sources in England, hired him. They gave him a code name, Arabelle. They trained him in invisible ink. They gave him a code book, money for expenses, and instructions to reach London and start reporting on British military conditions. Pujol agreed to everything. He had no intention of going to Britain. He had never been there. He couldn't have found Glasgow on a map without help. But none of that mattered, because Juan Pujol García had just accomplished something no other spy in history had managed. He hadn't been recruited by either side. He had recruited himself, hired by the enemy he planned to destroy, rejected by the ally he intended to save. Instead of London, Pujol went to Lisbon. He rented an apartment, bought a blue guide to England, a tourist guidebook, picked up a map of the British Isles, and started writing intelligence reports about a country he had never visited. His tools were absurd: the guidebook, British railway timetables, cinema newsreels, and newspapers from the Lisbon Public Library. From these, he fabricated detailed reports, on troop movements near Liverpool, naval activity in the English Channel, and civilian morale in cities he couldn't describe from memory because he'd never walked their streets. He wrote them in invisible ink between the lines of innocuous letters and mailed them to an Abwehr cover address in Madrid. And then he did something that would define the entire operation. He started inventing people, not just sources, fully realized characters with names, nationalities, occupations, backstories, and personalities. A wealthy Venezuelan student at the University of Glasgow, a Gibraltarian waiter who traveled around Britain, a fanatically racist South African whose anti-communist views made him a willing Nazi collaborator. Each fictional agent filed separate reports, had separate expenses, and generated separate intelligence. The Abwehr loved it. They rated Arabelle as one of their most productive sources in Britain and started sending money to fund the growing network. But Pujol was building a fiction from a continent away, and cracks were showing. One report described a dock worker in Glasgow who would do anything for a liter of wine. Scots drink whiskey and beer. They don't measure in liters. It was exactly the kind of error that proved the author was thinking in continental terms, not British. Somewhere in London, someone was about to notice. British intelligence was reading German Abwehr communications through Ultra, the top-secret program that decrypted enemy signals. And buried in the intercepts, analysts found something strange. An Abwehr agent, codenamed Arabelle, was filing creative, detailed reports about Britain that were sometimes alarmingly close to accurate, but riddled with errors no one actually living in the country would make. The leaders, the currency mistakes, descriptions that read like someone narrating a guidebook rather than walking a street. MI5 couldn't tell if Arabelle was a real spy with bad information or something else entirely. They launched an investigation. By early 1942, they traced the mystery agent to Lisbon and identified Juan Pujol García, the same man their colleagues in Madrid had dismissed 3 times. The irony was almost unbearable. The best deception operation running against the Abwehr was being conducted by an untrained amateur the British themselves had refused to hire. In April 1942, MI5 extracted Pujol from Lisbon and brought him to London. They assigned him a case officer named Tomás Harris, half Spanish, half English, a former art dealer with an instinct for narrative and character that would prove more valuable than any spy manual. And they gave Pujol a codename, Garbo, because like the great actress Greta Garbo, he was the greatest actor in the world. The partnership transformed the operation. What had been a brilliant but fragile one-man improvisation became a professionally managed deception machine. Harris brought MI5's resources, real intelligence to blend with the fiction, actual knowledge of Britain to replace guidebook guesswork, a radio transmitter to replace postal letters. Pujol brought the thing that couldn't be taught, imagination. Over the next 2 years, Garbo and Harris built the fictional network into a masterpiece of sustained invention. 27 agents and sub-agents, each with a voice, a personality, a motivation for spying, and a salary the Germans dutifully paid. The Abwehr funneled approximately £20,000 over the course of the war, roughly £1 million in today's money, to fund people who had never existed. When an agent's storyline became too complicated to maintain, Garbo killed him off. Agent 1, a Portuguese character based in Wales, was reported dead. Garbo then extracted money from the Germans to support the fictional agent's fictional widow. The enemy was paying a pension for a woman who had never been born, mourning a husband who had never lived. But the operation wasn't without real danger. Pujol's wife, Araceli, had followed him from Spain to Lisbon to London. She hadn't signed up for espionage. She was raising their children in a foreign country during wartime, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, subordinate to an operation she couldn't discuss with anyone. Her frustration boiled over into a genuine security crisis. She threatened to walk into the Spanish embassy and expose everything unless MI5 improved their living conditions. For a brief, terrifying window, the most elaborate deception in intelligence history was nearly undone, not by German counterintelligence, but by a domestic argument. MI5 managed the situation. Araceli was briefly detained. The crisis passed, but it exposed the invisible cost, the fact that behind the fictional agents and radio transmissions, a real family was absorbing the pressure. The marriage would not survive the war. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking toward the biggest gamble of the 20th century. In early 1944, Allied command finalized plans for the invasion of France. D-Day would target Normandy, but the deception planners understood that if the Germans concentrated their full strength there, the invasion could be thrown back into the sea. The solution was Operation Fortitude South, and at its center was a phantom, FUSAG, the first United States Army group, supposedly massed in southeast England under General George S. Patton, the American commander the Germans most feared. FUSAG's paper strength was approximately 150,000 troops, with tanks, artillery, and landing craft. In reality, it consisted of inflatable rubber tanks, plywood guns, dummy landing craft, and a small signals unit, generating the radio chatter of an entire army group. The deception needed a voice the Germans trusted to confirm what the rubber tanks suggested from the air. That voice was Garbo. 3 years of carefully calibrated intelligence, real facts mixed with strategic lies, delivered through 27 fictional agents, every piece designed to build credibility without revealing the game. All of it converged on a single objective: convince the Germans that Normandy was a diversion, convince them the real blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, 200 miles northeast, convince them to keep their strongest forces, including Panzer reserves, waiting at Calais for an invasion that would never come. Everything Pujol had built since that Lisbon apartment, every invented character, every fabricated report, every carefully managed near-miss was about to be cashed in on a single hand. The chicken farmer from Barcelona was playing for the highest stakes imaginable, and 156,000 Allied soldiers on the beaches were the bet. June 6, 1944. Garbo transmits his warning into silence. Madrid doesn't answer. Hours later, when the landings are public knowledge, he makes contact and unleashes a calculated tirade. "I cannot accept excuses or negligence on your part," the message reads. "Were it not for my faith in the Führer and the vital importance of my work, I would abandon the service. The Fury is theater. The invocation of the Führer is a masterpiece of performed loyalty from a man systematically destroying the Führer's war machine." Kuhlenthal, his handler in Madrid, is mortified. He apologizes profusely. The exchange is forwarded to Berlin, where it transforms Garbo from trusted agent into irreplaceable asset, the loyal spy who tried to save them and was failed by his own side's incompetence. 3 days later, on the night of June 8th, Garbo sits down at the transmitter for the message everything has been building toward. 2,000 words, 2 hours of sustained Morse code. The message synthesizes reports from fictional agents across southern England and constructs a meticulous case. The Normandy landings are a diversionary maneuver designed to draw reserves away from the real target. Pas-de-Calais, FUSAG is poised. Patton is ready. Hold your forces. Kuhlenthal receives it and forwards it urgently to Berlin. It reaches OKW, the German High Command. An intelligence assessment citing Agent Arabelle endorses the conclusion: Normandy is a feint. The Panzer reserves stay at Calais. The 15th Army, the strongest German force in France, does not move. 200 miles. From the beaches where Allied soldiers are clawing their way inland, the armored divisions that could have pushed them into the sea sit waiting for an army made of rubber. The beach is held, the beachhead expanded, and the reserves at Calais kept waiting for days, then weeks, for an invasion that existed only in Garbo's radio messages and inflatable tank parks photographed from 30,000 feet. British intelligence confirmed the impact through ultra-intercepts. Garbo's message had reached the highest level of German command and directly influenced the decision to hold reserves. The chicken farmer's fiction had become military fact. On July 29, 1944, the Abwehr awarded Juan Pujol García the Iron Cross, second class, for outstanding service to the Reich. The man, who had spent 3 years destroying German intelligence, received one of Hitler's medals for doing it. 5 months later, King George VI appointed Pujol a member of the Order of the British Empire. He was now one of the only people in history decorated by both sides in the same war for the same work. Germany honored him for outstanding intelligence. Britain honored him for outstanding deception. They were celebrating the same performance. But here's the detail that explains why the deception lasted as long as it did. Garbo's German handler, Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, was partly Jewish. His grandfather had been Jewish, and under Nazi racial laws, that made him permanently suspect. He compensated with zealous productivity, and his most valuable asset was Arabelle. Kuhlenthal couldn't afford to doubt Garbo. Doubting Garbo meant destroying the one achievement that justified his existence in a regime that questioned his blood. The handler was more trapped than the agent. The deceiver was freer than the deceived. The war ended. The operation shut down. And then Juan Pujol García did what he did best. He disappeared. Around 1949, reports surfaced that he had died of malaria in Africa. The world's greatest double agent was officially dead, except he wasn't. Pujol had faked his own death and relocated to Caracas, Venezuela, where he lived under his real name for 35 years, running a bookshop while the world thought he was in a grave. In 1984, intelligence historian Nigel West, convinced by inconsistencies in the death records, traced Pujol to Venezuela and found him alive at 72. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Pujol visited the Normandy beaches. He stood on the sand where his phantom army had held the line. Around him were veterans, dignitaries, reporters, families of the fallen. Nobody recognized the quiet old man in civilian clothes. Nobody knew that the person standing among them had once commanded 150,000 troops that didn't exist, run 27 agents who had never drawn breath, and sent a radio message from a suburban house in London that froze armored divisions 200 miles from the shore. He was the most important person on the beach, and he was invisible. For a spy, that was exactly right. Juan Pujol García died in Caracas on October 10, 1988, aged 76. The chicken farmer who fooled Hitler and saved D-Day, buried in a small coastal town in Venezuela, far from Barcelona, far from London, far from the sand where his fictions held the line.